The White House says they're proud of the way they left Afghanistan. We'll have more on that debacle in just a moment. Also, crime in America is getting so out of control that even some Democrats are now starting to call into question what is their strategy. And a ruling at the Supreme Court that deals with men masquerading as women in sports. Its verdict with Senator Ted Cruz. Senator, nice to be with you. And the Biden administration is really excited. They think they nailed it on Afghanistan. They're very proud of what they did. They came out with this paper that they said proves how good the withdrawal was from Afghanistan. And that's apparently the history books, how it's going to be remembered if you listen to this administration. Your reaction?
Look, I think it's really sad. We've talked before in this podcast about how this White House treats national security and foreign policy as public relations. It's all a communications effort. So they put out this 12-page white paper that is just designed to say everything's perfect, everything's fine, and they're hoping that the media will bleat like sheep and go along with that the disaster, the debacle of Biden's surrender to the Taliban and withdrawal from Afghanistan will be forgotten. I think that's disrespectful to the 13 servicemen and women who were murdered there. I think it's disrespectful to the Afghans we left behind who were tortured, whose lives, who may well have been murdered as well. I think it's disrespectful to all of those who shed blood, who lost limbs fighting in Afghanistan, that this administration cares so little about their sacrifice, they're not even bothering to worry about what went wrong.
You and I talked about this on a previous podcast not that long ago, that one of the individuals on the ground there that was trying to save lives told his story finally that he believed he had the suicide bomber in his sights.
Yes.
There was no chain of command. There was no orders allowed basically for them to take out this prospective suicide bomber. And then all of a sudden he's blown up and survived it. Many others did not that you just mentioned. But for them to come out with a white paper, and white paper is supposed to be non-political, serious documents. This was political propaganda at its best.
So let me say that the podcast we did several weeks ago, if you didn't listen to it, let me encourage you to go back and listen to it, because it really is, it's a powerful, this young Marine testified before the House of Representatives, and he told his story. He told the story that the suicide bomber, they had intel about who he was, and they spotted him, and they had him in their sights, and they could have taken him out. They could have taken him out before he committed the suicide bombing, and the political higher-ups in the Biden administration wouldn't allow them to do so. And the result was 13 servicemen and women were murdered, and this young Marine was horrendously injured. He wasn't killed, but he told his story. And I got to say, the reason I would encourage you to go back and listen to that podcast is because the media won't cover it. They won't cover it at all. They're facts that don't exist. Because if you listen, in that pod, we played almost the entirety of his congressional testimony because it was so powerful. And it's a story that in any sane world should be the lead story on the 6 o'clock news. And yet, when we have journalists that refused to tell the truth, refuse to cover news, refuse to cover facts, that view their job as propagandists for the White House, it's terrible. And look, here you've got John Kirby, the appointed spokesperson, just standing up and
he was offended that the media even questioned him and this administration's response in Afghanistan. He got animated, like not animated that Americans died and that he was frustrated about what happened with the Taliban. Animated that how dare you think we didn't do this perfectly. Take a look.
And so for all this talk of chaos, I just didn't see it, not from my perch. At one point during the evacuation, there was an aircraft taking off full of people, Americans and Afghans alike, every 48 minutes. And not one single mission was missed. So I'm sorry, I just won't buy the whole argument of chaos.
He's right, they were taking off. They were taking off with Americans and other people that were trying to clamor, and some that lost their lives, hanging on, trying to be stowaways on an airplane.
Yeah, and let's be clear, hanging on to the wheels as the planes were taking off. He said he didn't see it. He didn't see the chaos. Look, that's offensive. I got to tell you, if it were my spouse, my brother, my sister who died in that suicide bombing, listening to that, I'm going to speak nicely, that individual saying, I didn't see any chaos. Say that to the 13 coffins that came back with American flags on them. He didn't see any chaos. Say that to the Afghan interpreters who risked their lives to help us, only to be abandoned by these clowns, to be tortured to death by the Taliban. He didn't see any chaos. Well, what about abandoning the Bagram airfield, a secure military airfield that we spent billions building, and abandoning it before the evacuation happened? For him to say he didn't see any chaos, I believe him. But that's because he's deliberately looking away. They don't want, they're like the monkey, see no evil, hear no evil. Let me tell you something, that's evil. Because their screw up cost people lives, and if he didn't see any chaos, it's only because he refused to look.
Historically, white papers have usually been serious documents, not propaganda like this. And when they have tried to use these kind of big synopsis of historic events that have gone wrong for political reasons, usually the media will throw down on that. They're not doing it this time. Is that how far we've lost the media, in your opinion? I mean, anyone that sees this, and there were a few that did call them out on this, but by not calling them out, aren't you basically going along with the narrative? Because there's some that are going to say, okay, I'm not going to report on it. I'll just be silent. That'll be my way of protesting it.
Look, there is a theme across the board of this administration and this White House. They lie for a living. Whether it's John Kirby lying about Afghanistan, whether it is Mayorkas lying in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, whether it's Karine Jean-Pierre standing up and lying over and over and over again. People aren't just walking across the border, she says. Well, that's a lie.
Yeah.
Yes, they are. They are today. The amazing thing about that lie of hers, it is a lie every day of the year, 365 days a year, because there has not been a day when Joe Biden was president when there were not people walking across the border. And the brazenness of it, he can stand up and say, I didn't see any chaos, because he knows that the number of journalists remaining in America is vanishingly small, that they might as well have pom-poms and miniskirts and be chanting, go Biden, because that's where they are. Look at the next thing Kirby said.
Nobody's saying that everything was perfect, but there was a lot that went right, and a lot of Afghans are now living better lives in this country and other countries around the world because of the sacrifices and the work of so many American government officials. So yeah, there's a lot to be proud of, Peter.
He's mad. How dare you question us?
And he's proud. There's a lot to be proud of. Really, you want to tell those widows that? How proud you are of the incompetence of this administration? And by the way, at the time this happened, everybody knew it was incompetent. If you remember Afghanistan, when the disaster happened, this White House was caught flat-footed because up until that point, the press had just been cheering them on, and it was the first criticism they got because it was so bad. People turned on the TV and saw human beings clinging to the wheels of planes as they took off. They saw people
falling from the planes.
That nobody could defend it at the time. See, what's really shameless about this also is this is revisionist history. This is trying to go back and say, don't believe your lying eyes when you saw it happen. I'm telling you what the official government story is. He's proud of the job they did. You know what is shocking? Nobody lost their job. Secretary of Defense wasn't fired. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs wasn't fired. John Kirby wasn't fired. John Kirby's like Baghdad Bob. He stands up there and just spins. No chaos, everything great, you should be proud. Nobody lost their job. The commanding officer that refused to give the order, take out the suicide bomber before he murders those servicemen and women. As far as we know, that commanding officer didn't lose his or her job. Zero accountability. And the Biden White House doesn't want any accountability. This white paper is designed to cover up and to tell an alternate history. Everything's fine. You know, it's reminiscent of during the Antifa and Black Lives Matter riots. Yeah. fiery but mostly peaceful protest. That's their...
As buildings are burning behind
Yes,
reporters.
yes.
Mostly peaceful out here as a building's burning behind them.
That is what John Kirby is doing, and he thinks the American people are either stupid or lazy.
I want to play another clip of Kirby, but before we get to that, I want to talk to you real quick about our friends at Augusta Precious Metals. You know what's happening in the economy. You know what's been happening with banks recently. And if you're close to retirement age or in retirement and you need to preserve your hard-earned dollars, protect your wealth, I want you to check out Augusta Precious Metals. You can go online to Augusta Precious Metals right now, and you can do something that no one else does in the industry. They actually do a web conference with you one-on-one, talking about your retirement, talking about your savings, talking about your 401k, and how gold and silver can be used to help you preserve and protect your wealth. Look, if you're close to retirement, you know there's no time to make up losses. That is where gold and silver can come in to diversify your portfolio. Call them and use my name, Ben, and they will actually give you for 10 years all of your fees covered. The number, 877-4-GOLD-IRA, 877-4-GOLD-IRA, or online at AugustaPreciousMetals.com. Use the promo code Ben, AugustaPreciousMetals.com. Senator, I want to play just another example of Kirby because he wasn't backing down. I got to respect the plan. Go in there, defend at all costs. Do not accept any type of defeat on anything. Here's another example of the arrogance.
Once you turn it over, it's just like what we're doing in Ukraine. We give Ukraine artillery ammunition, Stinger anti-air missiles, Javelin anti-tank. It's their stuff at that point, not the Americans. It's their stuff. That stuff belonged to the Afghans. And so this idea, this argument is just ludicrous that we left millions of dollars of stuff in Afghanistan. We didn't. We turned it over, as the previous administration would have done too, because part of their thinking was they were going to have to turn this material over. It was turned over appropriately and carefully and deliberately with the Afghan National Security Defense Forces.
It wasn't done carefully. I think we can agree on that. It wasn't done appropriately in an orderly fashion the way that he described it. And it wasn't turned over to the Afghan forces the way he implied, because we saw this stuff pop into the hands of actual terrorists instantly on social media.
Yeah, so he left out kind of the most important context. It's true that we gave the Afghan military weapons to kill the Taliban. What the Biden administration screwed up and did is they let all those weapons fall in the hands of the Taliban. So literally, we gave them these weapons to shoot the terrorists. Now the terrorists have the weapons that were given to shoot the terrorists. And by the way, among other things, what all's been lost? So the Taliban are believed to control more than 2,000 armored vehicles, including U.S. Humvees, up to 40 aircrafts, potentially including Black Hawks and Scout attack helicopters and Scan Eagle military drones. Between 2002 and 2017, the United States gave the Afghan military an estimated $28 billion in weapons, including guns, rockets, night vision goggles, and small drones for intelligence gathering. Between 2003 and 2016, the United States provided Afghan forces with 208 aircraft. And since 2003, the United States has provided Afghan forces with at least 600,000 infantry weapons, including M16s, including 162,000 pieces of communication equipment, and including over 16,000 night vision goggles. And the night vision goggles, when you talk to special forces troops that have been deployed there, the night vision goggles actually concern them maybe more than anything else, because one of the great advantages our military had in dealing with the terrorists is that we had the ability to see at night and to wage warfare at night, and the terrorists couldn't see us. Now, thanks to these guys' incompetence, the terrorists are equipped like a U.S. military battalion. And for him to claim, well, gosh, it was theirs. No, the weapons were given to kill them. These are Taliban terrorists. And the sad thing is, we know Americans are going to lose their lives with those M16s, with those weapons, with those night vision goggles. We know that Americans will die. And this administration will wipe their hands and say there was no chaos. It was their equipment, and they're proud of handing billions of dollars of military weapons over to the Taliban. Does Kirby remember September 11th? Does he remember the planes flying into the World Trade Center? Does he remember the plane flying into the Pentagon? These are the same bastards that now have billions of dollars of U.S. military equipment. Those guys killed over 3,000 lives with a couple of box cutters. Now they've got armored vehicles and M16s and Black Hawk helicopters. To say this is a catastrophic screw-up is an understatement.
Oh, he says it was organized, though.
I agree. It was an organized screw-up. It could not have been screwed up more if they tried. And look, part of the reason, I mentioned before Bagram Airfield. Listen, at some point we were going to pull out of Afghanistan. I think it made sense. I'm not a believer in forever wars. I'm not a believer in staying there forever. But when you are doing a drawdown, it makes sense to have a serious, competent plan for drawing down, number one, to get all the Americans out. Number two, to get your allies, the Afghans who risked their lives, out. Number three, to vet the Afghans who are coming to make sure you're not bringing terrorists. What was amazing about what Biden did is it was utter chaos on a couple of fronts. Number one, the White House set an arbitrary political deadline. They said, okay, troops must be drawn down to 2,500 or fewer. And their goal was they wanted to be out on the anniversary of September 11th. It was a political deadline. It was set by the White House. We want to trumpet this political objective. Look, we got out of this war, so we're setting the date, 9/11, so we can have
a big victory.
Mission accomplished. This is George W. Bush landing on the aircraft carrier. This is Joe Biden saying mission accomplished. And listen, the military told the White House, we can't secure Bagram Airfield and also the embassy and the airport in Kabul. And the White House essentially said, we don't care. We've set a goal. It's a political goal. Never mind the military problems. And so they forced the military to abandon Bagram Airfield. Now, the problem is, if you're going to do a withdrawal, you want to do it from a secure airfield where people can't come in with suicide bombers and kill people. When they abandoned Bagram and handed it to the Taliban, they were forced to do their withdrawal from a crowded commercial airport in the middle of a dense urban environment that didn't have a secure perimeter. They had a secure airport. They gave it away. And their withdrawal of Afghans was both over-inclusive and under-inclusive. It was under-inclusive in that they left a great many people behind who had risked their lives to help the American military. And it is grotesquely immoral that we know that at least some of those have been tortured and perhaps even murdered by the Taliban as a result of their helping America. But it was also over-inclusive in that at the end, it seemed like they were just grabbing up anyone who showed up. And so we don't know how many terrorists the Biden administration flew to America. What we do know is that included among those that they evacuated were adult men with child brides. Because, look, you'd have a family that was desperate to get their little girl out of Afghanistan, and so they'd take a little girl, a young 10, 11, 12-year-old girl, and hand that child over to a grown-ass man and say, have her as your wife.
You asked Anthony Blinken about this.
Yes.
I want to play this because this is that moment where, again, this administration doesn't want to admit this happened.
Across the entire government, everyone involved in the evacuation effort, whether it's at a transit point in one of the countries that we negotiated with, whether it's here in the United States at Dulles or Philadelphia or the military bases, we have all of our officers at extreme vigilance to look for and to deal with any cases or concerns that
Did you
arise.
receive the urgent guidance, and how many child brides have you seen?
I don't know the specific guidance you're referring to. I'm happy to look at it.
So is there not urgency to discover if children are being abused?
Absolutely.
Time of the senator has expired.
We could detect and deal with any cases, and there have been, to my knowledge, a limited number of cases where we have separated people because we were concerned that they were.
How many?
The cases I'm aware of, a handful.
So look, you see the Secretary of State blithely unconcerned, a handful. The guidance I was describing was guidance the Biden administration put out to personnel on the ground because they were getting planes landing from Afghanistan with adult men and little girls. The little girls, they were saying, were their wives, and these little girls were being sexually assaulted and raped by grown men. And the Biden administration was facilitating child sexual assault and child brides. This guidance was within the Biden administration saying, wait a second, we got a problem. We're putting people on planes and...
Not moms with daughters, dudes with little girls.
Yes.
That should be red flag number one.
Yes. So at the hearing, he hadn't read the guidance. I had the guidance in front of me. I'd read it. But beyond that, I even asked him how many have you found? Listen, if you're Secretary of State and you just finished human trafficking little girls into the country that are being sexually assaulted by grown men and you're responsible, you know what a competent Secretary of State would say? Here's exactly how many we found. Here's what's happened to them. They're going to jail. Here are the safeguards we're putting in place to protect against it. But all of this is intertwined. Look, people ask me, why is the Biden administration so bad at this stuff? Why are they so incompetent? Part of the reason they're so bad, part of the reason Afghanistan was such a mess is because they live in an environment where they don't expect the press to ever ask a hard question. So Tony Blinken doesn't think anyone's going to ask him about the child brides that he's responsible for trafficking into America.
You don't have to worry about a 60 Minutes piece on it and the disaster of what has happened. They know they've got him in their back pocket.
It produces incredibly poor execution. By the way, these are the same people who, were incredibly condescending and arrogant during the Trump administration, and then when they came in, one of their favorite lines was, the adults are back in charge. Well, these adults don't know what the hell they're doing. And as much as John Kirby tells you there is no chaos, he's proud of what happened, anyone who was awake during the disaster of the surrender to the Taliban and the withdrawal in Afghanistan knows what an utter catastrophe it is. And I got to say, it's not just you and me. We've been unloading on the press, but here's a little bit of a man bites dog. Sometimes even the press can't stand it. Watch this. CBS News calling out John Kirby's garbage.
But they called in, or National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said they were going to do a hot wash, which is a fancy bureaucratic term for a deep dive into what went wrong. This 12-page document is a whitewash. It is narrative. It is light on specifics. It's devoid of citations. And it is, in essence, their version of events.
I got to say, it's almost like he knows so much about what really happened in Afghanistan that he's insulted personally. Yeah. Like, how dare you expect me to walk out here and carry this pail of garbage with me to the American people? I deserve more respect than that. And I'm glad to see some journalists actually coming around to this.
Look, good for him for being angry, because that was genuine.
Yeah.
He was pissed at having read a document that was utterly divorced from reality, that was crafted not by national security experts trying to examine how did we screw this up, what did we do wrong, who's at fault, why didn't we give the order to take out the suicide bomber before he murdered 13 servicemen and women. It's none of that. That white paper is a PR document. It is a political spin document. It is talking points for the obedient mandarins in the press to echo, we should be proud of the job Joe Biden did in Afghanistan. There was no chaos at all. It was perfect.
Yeah.
And at least on CBS News, and I'll say the anchor who's there, when he says it was a whitewash, she laughs out loud.
Yeah.
Good on CBS News. For a moment, journalism erupted. I hope it's contagious and we actually have others willing to do their jobs.
I want to get to another issue, and that's crime in America. There was a very famous individual who was brutally murdered, stabbed to death in San Francisco this week, the founder of Cash App. But first, I want to tell you about our friends over at Chalk, CHOQ.com. They are helping men gain back their masculinity. If you're getting a little older, you feel like you're losing an edge, Chalk Male Vitality Stack can help you get back 20% of your testosterone in just 90 days. So if you're feeling like you're complacent, try Chalk and see what they can do for you. Chalk is here to help you on a simple issue of focus on getting your way of life back that you feel like you may have lost that edge. Online, Chalk, CHOQ.com. Use my code Ben. You'll get 35% off any Chalk subscription. Cancel anytime. I've been taking the Chalk Male Vitality Stack now for, I think, almost 2 months. It works. You can get that testosterone level up to 20% more than it is right now in just 90 days. CHOQ.com. That's CHOQ.com. Use promo code Ben for 35% off. Senator, talking about crime in America, it's very interesting. Lori Lightfoot, for example, lost in Chicago. A lot of people thought that was kind of the end of the road for the insanity of not prosecuting criminals, being weak on crimes, giving this, bail reform and everything else that's happened. We're seeing some pushback in places like New York and Baltimore. Then all of a sudden they elect an actual communist in Chicago, head scratcher there. You look at San Francisco, they've got major problems with crime. And now you see this brutal stabbing that's so bad that we can't even show you the video that's come out here. I just don't think it's appropriate, of a man who has said some things about San Francisco. He doesn't feel safe there. He'd actually moved. He came back for a meeting. He's in the street, gets stabbed there to death in San Francisco, and yet Democrats are still standing by these initiatives of bail reform, prison reform, and not actually getting tough on crime. More than 500 police officers are missing in San Francisco right now, and people there are leaving in droves, and they're sick and tired of living in this insanity.
Yeah, look, what happened here, Bob Lee, who was the founder of Cash App, he was a tech gazillionaire, very wealthy man, very successful man. He had left San Francisco. He had left San Francisco because of the out-of-control crime. And he was back in San Francisco for a work meeting. And on the street, he was stabbed. He was stabbed multiple times in the chest on the street. He was in San Francisco's Rincon Hill neighborhood, which is where Nancy Pelosi lives. He was not in the hood.
Yeah.
He was not. This is where rich people gather. And he's stabbed multiple times. There's security video of it. And you and I debated before the show, do we air the security video? We both watched it. We decided not to air it because it's really troubling. It is footage of this man losing his life. It is footage of him staggering after he's been stabbed. The footage shows him trying to flag down passing cars. Passing cars ignore him.
And probably because they're thinking about their own safety.
Yeah, they may be afraid for their own lives. They see someone staggering towards them. Crime is so bad, they may not want to be injured themselves, but they drive off, and he staggers to the window at the front of a building, and he collapses. And he had called 911, and the officers arrived, but by the time they got there, it wasn't in time to save him. And a kitchen knife with a 4-inch blade was found in the parking lot across the street, but they haven't caught anyone. There haven't been any arrests. So far this year, and we're not very far into this year, we're in April, there have already been 39 murders in the city. 39 murders already. And the San Francisco Police Department right now has a shortage of 541 officers.
Totally insane number when you think about the population the size of San Francisco, that you're 500 plus officers down.
look, it is the policies of the left attacking and demonizing police officers, trying to defund police officers, trying to abolish the police, combined with putting into place George Soros DAs like Alvin Bragg in New York, who release violent criminals onto the street, who don't prosecute criminals on the front end, and when they do get in, they let them go. That's what produces this chaos. You know, I've got a friend of mine who used to live in Northern California, lived in Palo Alto. He's been very successful. He's in the tech business. And he moved from Palo Alto down to Miami. And he and I had breakfast a while back, and he was telling me that he said friends of his from Palo Alto come down to Miami to visit him. And he'll take him out to dinner. And, you know, he drives a very nice, very fancy sports car. You'd like his car. And he'll drive out to dinner and park it on the street. And he said his friends from Northern California freak out. They're like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
What he said was, in Northern California, if you park a car on the street, even in a nice neighborhood, that car is going to get broken into, it's going to get keyed, it's going to get stolen, it's going to get vandalized. And what an amazing statement that just being able to park your car is considered a flex. Like, his friends would freak out. How could you park your car? And he's like, look, I live in America. Like, normal people can park their car and
not have to worry.
It is tragic what is happening, and I think a lot of the residents in these cities believe it can't get any better. In New York, a lot of the residents there just view that's part of life. By the way, at least one of the stories, I think it was the AP story, said tech entrepreneur died in San Francisco. Died,
just
not
random.
murdered,
Yeah.
not stabbed to death. Died. Because the press is not actually reporting the facts, because the facts would not be convenient for their political narrative. Look, last week in D.C., a staffer for Rand Paul was stabbed on the street multiple times. It was like 5 o'clock in the afternoon. In a busy D.C. street, he gets stabbed. When you have these left-wing mayors, district attorneys, police chiefs, when they undermine the cops and they let violent criminals go, the results are horrific. And I'll tell you, this is occurring at the same time. So the U.S. Sentencing Commission has just proposed to allow district judges broad discretion to grant what's called compassionate release for prisoners who haven't served their full sentences. Under federal law, when you're convicted of a federal crime, you get a sentence under what's called the sentencing guidelines that were passed. Congress passed them into law to provide uniformity and predictability so that people who committed the same crimes would serve similar sentences, that there had been massive disparities. If you got lucky and got a soft on crime judge, they'd let you go. If you got a really tough on crime judge, they'd lock you up. So the sentencing guidelines were passed to give some consistency, uniformity, predictability. Well, Joe Biden has managed to appoint new people to the Sentencing Commission, and they just proposed taking the compassionate release provision, which was designed to be really narrow. Someone has...
I would say, give an example of where that would have been used.
Compassionate release, someone has cancer and they're about to die, and say, okay, all right, we'll let you go for the last couple of months of your life so you can be outside of prison.
With your family.
Circumstances that are narrow and exigent, but under these revisions, it's opening the door. Look, Joe Biden has been filling the courts with soft on crime, left-wing activists, with criminal defense attorneys, with people who worked as George Soros district attorneys, with people who have been advocates of abolishing the police. They're becoming federal judges. And with this change in the Sentencing Commission, you're going to see these Biden radicals teaming up with the Obama radicals that are already on the court, releasing more and more violent criminals. And I got to say, Ben, look, in the normal world of political back and forth, there are things conservatives and liberals can disagree on. All right, high taxes, low taxes. You and I both like low taxes. I understand people that like higher taxes. Like, reasonable people can disagree on that. A question like abortion. Abortion is a difficult issue. I'm pro-life, you're pro-life, but there are many people who are genuinely and passionately pro-choice, and reasonable people can wrestle with that issue. I genuinely don't understand these leftists that see a murderer and think the answer here is let the murderer go. I don't get the reasoning. I don't know how to articulate the argument how society is better, how anyone is better off letting violent criminals go out on the streets. And yet that's what these radicals are doing, and it's what the Biden administration keeps leaning in further and further on.
Last question on this, and I think the shock for me seems to be how many cities are dealing with violent high crime numbers, and yet when their elections come up and they have a chance to change course, they don't do it. I mentioned Chicago earlier, my hometown of Memphis, Tennessee, out of control violent crime right now, carjackings through the roof, rape through the roof. 45 cars are stolen every 24 hours right now in my hometown. And this is because of an activist DA that came in and has said, we're going to let them all go all the time. They have prison reform, bail reform. They had a guy that was accused of murder the other day that got out on no bail because he was poor.
Yeah.
And you see this and you think, all right, well, surely at some point they're going to be voted out. And then you see Chicago, they get rid of Lightfoot and they put in someone that is even more radical.
Yeah.
Why is that happening? And are we going to just lose these cities forever? Because people that have the means to get out, this is my theory, are getting out as fast as they can, regardless of the Republican or Democrat. If you're sane and you have the means, you run as fast as you can for safety, for you, your kids, your grandkids. And then there are just activists left that get to decide how this is going to go for the rest of their lives with all this chaos.
Look, if you want to understand the pattern of the lawless left, if you want to understand the George Soros prosecutors, and by the way, let me say something. Folks online say when you refer to a George Soros prosecutor that you're anti-Semitic because George Soros is Jewish. How dare you blame him? Look, it has nothing to do with the fact that he's Jewish. What it has to do with is he spends tens of millions of dollars electing district attorneys who come into office promising to let violent criminals go. And part of the way the Marxists operate is when you point out what they're doing, they scream racist at you for daring to point out what he's doing. I don't know. If we had George Soros as a guest on this show, I don't know how he would defend that. I legitimately do not understand what his reasoning is that he thinks the world would be better if we let murderers and rapists go to commit more murders and more rapes. My mind doesn't comprehend that logic. If you want to know more, though, you ought to buy my latest book, Justice Corrupted. Justice Corrupted explains in length. There's an entire chapter on the George Soros DAs. There's an entire chapter on the Antifa and Black Lives Matter riots and how this is deliberate, how it's systematic, and it lays out the facts. It's not hyperbole, it's not rhetoric, it's not invective. Justice Corrupted lays out the facts. Alvin Bragg, before Alvin Bragg was a household name.
He was in your book.
He is in the book Justice Corrupted because that's who he is. It's what he promised to do, to weaponize the legal system. Going after Donald Trump is entirely consistent. There's an entire chapter in Justice Corrupted about the deep state being weaponized to go after Donald Trump. And so this is a consistent pattern. And I got to say, in Chicago, you're right. Lori Lightfoot, number one, presided over out-of-control crime and shootings and horrific misery. She was also, I think, incompetent at it. And so the voters voted her out, and for a moment you thought, wow, maybe there'll be a moment of Chicago of people saying, gosh, I'd like to live in a safer city. And then they elected someone who's a left-wing radical who has spent years advocating for defunding and abolishing the police. And I don't know if he's more competent or not than Lori Lightfoot.
Time will tell.
But everything he's said up to this point is that he is going to hurt the police more, weaken the police more, and empower the criminals more. And when you elect radical Democrats like this, people die. You know, the left
Good people flee the city, and then there's even more carnage.
The left is fond of the slogan Black Lives Matter. They don't actually believe it because the consequence of electing left-wing radicals who undermine law enforcement is that more black lives are lost. There will be African-American children, there will be women, there will be men murdered in Chicago because of the consistent assault of left-wing Democrats on police officers. And I got to tell you, as I travel around, you've flown around the country with me quite a bit.
Yeah.
Inevitably, when I see police officers, I make a point of stopping, of shaking their hands, of saying thank you. Thank you for what you're doing. And I tell them, I say, look, a big part of my job is to have your back. And I talk to cops all over the country. I got to tell you, the most striking place to fly into is Chicago. I land at Chicago O'Hare Airport. I am with some regularity met by 10, 12, 15 uniformed police officers who come, they shake my hand, they give me patches. I've got in my office patches of the Chicago PD that are displayed in my office because those cops are so under assault. Joe Biden, with the COVID vaccine mandates, was saying fire half the police in Chicago if they won't get COVID vaccines. And it is... The left's assault on cops and law enforcement is dangerous, and you want to know why people are stabbed in the streets of San Francisco or Washington, D.C., it is because of these policies. They have a very real and a tragic consequence.
I want to get to one other subject that's really kind of exploded in this country, and it's women's sports. How do you protect them? Men masquerading as women, also known as trans men in women's sports. Before we get to that, let me tell you about our friends over at Patriot Mobile. If you've got a cell phone and your cell phone is with big tech, big mobile, there's a very good chance you may be paying your bill every month and not realizing they're actually fighting against your values. That's where Patriot Mobile comes in. Now, I have been using Patriot Mobile for years, and they're the only Christian conservative cell phone provider in the country. Now, why does that matter? Well, when you pay your bill every month at no extra cost to you, they take a percentage of that bill and they give it back to conservative causes and organizations that are fighting for First or Second Amendment rights, rights of unborn children, even helping with adoptions in this country. I love paying my bill to Patriot Mobile because I know I'm making a difference with a bill I was going to pay somewhere anyway. If you're ready to have your dollars go to places that value your values, check out Patriot Mobile. PatriotMobile.com/verdict. PatriotMobile.com/verdict. Call them 878-PATRIOT. That's 878-PATRIOT. Use the promo code VERDICT. You'll get the best deals of the day. You get to keep your same cell phone number when you switch. And if you have a small business, call them as well. They can help you with all those lines getting switched over. 878-PATRIOT. Senator, lastly, we have seen a lot of arguing and fighting in this country and over men and women's sports. We saw in Australia last week outrage at a man who won a women's golf tournament, made big bucks doing it. We see colleges now with these grand debates over men being in women's sports. And then there was a confusing, I say confusing because the headline doesn't really match the facts here, ruling from the Supreme Court on this issue with women and men's sports and men playing as women. Break this down, what the Supreme Court actually said this past week.
Well, let's start with the Supreme Court, and then we'll talk about the broader issue. So the Supreme Court had before it a case that came out of West Virginia. West Virginia passed a law that protects girls' sports and women's sports, and that says that biological males, people who were born male, can't compete in girls' sports. That's a law. It's a similar law that's been passed in many states across the country to protect girls' athletics. In this instance, there was the family of a 12-year-old child who was born biologically male, but who now identifies as a girl and wants to compete in girls' sports. That family filed a lawsuit arguing that the law West Virginia passed conflicts with either Title IX of federal law, which establishes and protects girls' sports, or conflicts with the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Now, the case is in the fairly early stages. The district court, a federal district court, initially enjoined the law's enforcement and did so in July of 2021. So to enjoin the law's enforcement means the district court issued an order, this West Virginia law has no force and effect. That injunction was in effect for almost 18 months, almost a year and a half. The state didn't fight the injunction, so they let the law be enjoined. They didn't fight it any further. While the injunction was in effect, they were in the district court. They were battling over the lawsuit. The district court ultimately ruled for the state of West Virginia, so rejected the plaintiff's claim that the West Virginia law was unconstitutional or contrary to federal law. And it's interesting, the judge clearly didn't like ruling that way. The judge wrote that even if you don't like this law, it's clear under federal law and the Constitution that you can separate boys' sports from girls' sports, and there's not a legal impediment to doing so. So the district court rules for the state of West Virginia. The plaintiff appeals, and the Fourth Circuit, the Court of Appeals, entered a new injunction enjoining the law while the appeal was pending. Court of Appeals didn't issue an opinion, just entered an injunction while the appeal was pending. This is the appeal of that emergency injunction. So what happened is the state of West Virginia went up to the Supreme Court and said, will you reverse the injunction that the Court of Appeals put in place? The Supreme Court said no. The full Supreme Court didn't issue an opinion, so there's no opinion at all. They just denied the application. Two justices, Justice Alito, joined by Justice Thomas, dissented. Now, Justice Alito's dissent is very short. It's 2 pages long. I have it right here. Justice Alito walks through the facts of what I just described, the procedural history of the case. Justice Alito and Justice Thomas say, I would grant the state's application. But even Justice Alito and Justice Thomas acknowledge, and I'll read from this dissent, quote, it is true that West Virginia allowed the district court's injunction to go unchallenged for nearly 18 months before seeking emergency relief from a second identical injunction. And it is a wise rule in general that a litigant whose claim of urgency is belied by his own conduct should not expect discretionary emergency relief from a court. In other words, a big part of the reason that the Supreme Court did not vacate this injunction is because West Virginia essentially acquiesced to it for a year and a half, did nothing for 18 months, and emergency relief, either granting an injunction or vacating an injunction, is exceptional relief. It's provided because it's an emergency. And
18 months later, it's not an emergency anymore.
It is very hard to say it's an emergency when you didn't do anything for 18 months. And so there have been lots of headlines saying, oh, the Supreme Court said that biological males can compete in girls' sports.
And that's not what they said.
They didn't address the merits. They might at some point, and I hope that they rule in a way that protects girls' sports and follows the law. But in this instance, I think this was a procedural ruling. I wish they'd vacated the injunction. And what?
Well, referencing it's just 2 pages long. The opinion there tells you it was more of a procedural thing, not a policy.
And even Justice Alito and Justice Thomas are acknowledging, hey, wait, there's a real problem here because they sat and acquiesced, but they went on and said, well, even so, it's a state law and the Court of Appeals didn't write an opinion and we shouldn't enjoin it with no explanation whatsoever. So, look, that has some force, but I wouldn't read this Supreme Court decision as foreshadowing that the Supreme Court 7-2 is going to rule that biological males have a right to compete in girls' sports. I don't think they're going to, and I don't think that's what this case means.
One other thing that happened this week is there's a swimmer, Riley Gaines, who's become very famous and a lot of support from conservatives and Christians because she came out, was one of the very first in women's swimming to come out and say, it is unfair that you're asking me, who I'm one of the best swimmers in women's sports, if not the best, in certain aspects of women's swimming, to compete with biological men. When she did this, the world, of course, erupted. The left went after to attack her. She's now doing events at campuses. You and I talked about this before the show. She was going to be doing an event at San Francisco University there. That event didn't get to happen because the left started to attack her physically. A man hit her apparently twice. Police had to barricade her in a room as they basically rushed her from the stage. She was held in that room, barricaded with the cops for about an hour. And the student body that was coming after her said some of the most horrific things to her as a woman. And if we wanted to bleep it all out, you wouldn't hear anything but a big, long bleep. We decided we're going to let you see this. I wanted to warn, and you wanted to as well. If you have kids listening, kids watching, they don't need to see this. But I do think that parents and grandparents need to understand this has become what's normal on college campuses. If you are a conservative speaker or even a conservative student or someone standing up for yourselves as an athlete saying, I shouldn't have to compete with men when I'm a woman.
So, look, that's exactly right, and I'll say a couple of things. Number one, Riley Gaines was a very successful female swimmer competing against, among others, Leah Thomas. Leah Thomas, born a biological male. Leah Thomas decided that he was a she, that he was a woman.
More than halfway through college, competing as a man, as a male swimmer.
And as a male swimmer, was thoroughly mediocre, was not winning meets regularly, and once Leah became Leah the woman, Leah Thomas won the NCAA national championship in swimming. Now, there are biological differences between men and women. There are biological differences in strength, in body mass. There's a reason why these controversies only emerge one way. You know what? If a biological woman wants to compete against men, nobody would care. If someone from the WNBA wants to compete in the NBA, great. That'd be amazing to watch. There's a reason we have a WNBA, because there is no woman on the face of the planet who can stop LeBron James. There may not be a man on the planet, but there is a reason. There are real and material differences between the genders. And so Riley Gaines was on campus, and she's at San Francisco State University, and she's there to speak, and there's a violent protest, and she says that she was physically hit twice by a biological man who now claims he's a woman. So you have a man physically assaulting, beating a woman, because she dares to say it's unfair to girls, it's unfair to women to force them to compete against people who are biological males. And this video is right after she was assaulted. This video is her being pulled out of the room by the police officers. This video is her being chased by the activists. And I want to underscore for our listeners, you know, Ben and I, we actually debated whether or not to air this. The profanity in this is bad. Every other word is an expletive. And look, we try to make this podcast a family podcast that is suitable for listeners of all ages. If we tried to bleep out the profanities, it would be, you couldn't hear anything that would be saying. But I actually think it's important. Look, if you have kids and it's not appropriate for the kids to hear, shut off the broadcast at this point. But I think it's important for people to hear this one. And actually, for this episode, if you're listening, this is a particularly good episode to go on YouTube. This is one of the 3 we do each week that's on video. You're going to hear it.
But you need to see the anger in the faces of the intolerant left, and this is now normal on college campuses.
It is so much worse and so much more powerful to see it. So I'd encourage you for this one, go on to YouTube. While you're there, subscribe on YouTube. But play this portion in particular, because if you see it, this is where your kids are going to go to school or are going to school. This is where your grandkids are going to go to school or are going to school. And you want to understand the radical, angry, violent left. What happened to Riley Gaines illustrates it perfectly. Let's play it.
It's just me. I'm good. I'm coming. coming. I'm good. Trust me, I'm good. Go ahead.
Trans rights are human rights! You crying! You fucking crying, bitch! Fuck you! Fuck you! Fuck you! Trans rights are human rights! Trans rights are human fucking rights! Bye, bitch! Bye, bitch! You dress like a communist. Fuck you! Fuck you! Trans women are women! 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 Trans women are women!
God help us.
I don't know how the university can watch that and not hold some of those students accountable, and I doubt they will.
Look, for all we know, there were administrators there. I mean, this podcast talked about Stanford Law School and how you had an administrator siding with the mob, screaming expletives at a sitting federal court of appeals judge. And mind you, these are students studying to be lawyers who don't know actually how to deal with a judge without screaming and cursing at him. Look, those students, presumably either they or their parents, are paying the university to teach their kids to get an education. This is what they're being taught. You know, when I watch that video, it's why I encourage people to watch the YouTube of this. When I watch the video, the hate in the eyes of those children, it's hate.
Yeah, it's indoctrinated.
It is rage. One of the most disturbing moments is a young woman who screams at Riley Gaines, "You crying." So she's just been physically assaulted. I don't know if she was injured. I hope she was not. But the mob, the bloodlust. Look, there's a reason in San Francisco the police officers take her out. Those officers are moving with dispatch because they're concerned for her safety. They're concerned that that mob, if they don't get her out, she didn't have a chance to speak, but if they don't get her out, they're concerned that that mob will continue to physically assault her and seriously injure her. Now, it says something about the university that they don't protect the safety of a speaker, that they don't stop the violent mob, that they don't discipline the students, that they don't arrest people engaged in violence. The university, in all likelihood, condones this activity. You know, a week ago, Tucker Carlson had a monologue where he talked about, in the wake of the horrific shooting in Nashville, he talked about the rage of many of the radical activists in the transgender community, the rage that they have to Christians and people of faith. And that part of the essence of faith and Christianity in particular is recognizing that man is a fallen creature and that we need God's grace and that God is sovereign, not us. It's not my will, but it's a higher will. And one of the points Tucker made is the essence of the radical activist's proposition is whatever I believe is the truth, that I am God. I can decide. And it is, you know, I just saw this week a movie premiere for the movie Nefarious.
Yeah.
Now, Nefarious is coming out next week. Nefarious was written by my good friend Steve Deace, And it's a terrific movie. And the premiere was in Dallas. And it's about a murderer on death row who's getting ready to be executed. And a psychiatrist comes in to interview the murderer to determine whether the murderer is sane, whether he is competent to be executed. And the murderer believes that he is possessed by a demon. And so the entire movie is back and forth between the psychiatrist and the murderer and the demon. And it is a Christian movie, but it's not a Christian movie in the sense that it beats you over the head with a sermon. It's actually it's a thriller. It's a horror film, and it's powerful. It's very well done. Unfortunately, some Christian movies are not very good.
Yeah.
This is a good movie, and with an amazing performance. Actually, both of the two lead actors are really, really good. But one of the exchanges of the demon, where he says, look, what did Lucifer say? Lucifer said, I am God. Do what thou wilt. That's the essence of rebellion to God, is do what thou wilt. I thought Tucker's monologue, I actually texted him that night, and I said, listen, what you said tonight was really powerful, and in today's environment was courageous. Because that kind of angry mob
is becoming the norm.
Look, I'm an optimist. I believe in our country. But when I see things like that, I fear for our country. We've got to rediscover sanity. And we've got to learn to talk to each other. We've got to do something about this rage and hatred that divides this country apart. This is what our kids are being taught on campuses. This is what the Marxists who are professors, the Marxists who are administrators are teaching our children. And if we don't teach them a better path,
we're in serious trouble.
Yeah.
Senator, always a pleasure to chat with you, my friend. Don't forget, if you're getting to watch this on Facebook or on YouTube, make sure you download our audio version. We do this show 3 days a week. There are 2 others that are just audio only. If you're just listening today, go back and watch that last segment on YouTube or on Facebook. It'll be there. You can see this interaction with Riley Gaines, and we will see you guys back here in a couple of days.